Hey friends, welcome back and happy holidays. I'm so happy to be spending this time with you here tonight. This episode is an oldie but goodie, and it was brought to us by the beloved Rick Merlin Levine. And what we will be doing is exploring the mythos of the Christmas star. Rick is masterful at weaving astrology, history, and mythology and taking us on a really soulful journey. Interestingly, this episode happened right before a historic moment, the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction of 2021. This was a pivotal collective moment for all of us. And now we're at the precipice of another historic moment as we are about to have the Saturn-Neptune conjunction at 0 degrees of Aries. So we thought that bringing this episode back right now, when we're at another collective turning point, would be an interesting and fruitful endeavor. Whether you're in a bustling full house right now or you're spending a quiet holiday season, I just want to take this opportunity to thank you for welcoming us into your home and your heart throughout 2025. I hope this show has brought you insights, awareness, and that special kind of light that astrological wisdom carries. Thank you for being a part of our community and enjoy the show. All right, so Rick, not only did I miss you last week, but I am so excited about this episode because I figured it could go either way. We're talking about the Christmas star of modern times. And I know you're going to take us on a little journey back to the Star of Bethlehem. And the big question in my mind is what's happening on Monday, the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, a similar event to what happened at the Star of Bethlehem when Jesus was born, or, as the story goes. So I can't wait to hear the answer because it's
let me answer that question as a multiple choice.
Okay.
The answer is A, yes, definitely. B, I'm not sure. I don't think so. C, absolutely not. And D, we'll never know. That's my answer, and I stand by it.
Wait, so Rick, I've been going through the multiple choice in my head. I'm like, it's either going to be yes, absolutely, no, that is preposterous. Yeah, so
Amanda, you know me better than that. My answers are absolutely yes and absolutely no. Exactly. Gemini rising, I get to do that.
All right, so let's dive in. Tell us about it.
Well, okay. There's a game that I like to play in astrology in general, and that's what's the same and what's different. Take two planets, Venus and Mars. They have stuff in common, and they have stuff that's different. Jupiter and Neptune, they have stuff in common, and they have stuff that's different. So in a way, we're looking at two moments in time. We're looking at a moment roughly 2,000 years ago, give or take a few years, and now. And we're saying, what do these two moments in time have in common? And what do they have not in common? And it turns out that they have a lot in common. And obviously they have a lot that's not in common. But, part of what happens this time of year is that regardless of what our religious affiliation is, and of course, because we are talking about the quote unquote Christmas star or the Star of Bethlehem, there is a connotation here of we are talking about a particular belief or story in a particular religion, i.e. Christianity in all of its many shades of existence. But the fact of the matter is that it doesn't matter what your religion is, because the events of approximately 2,000 years ago have had profound influence on planet Earth for 2,000 years. And so this is not about a religious affiliation. I just want to say that because people in our group, people anywhere, I mean, this is the internet, and people are here from all over the world and from many different affiliations. And this in no way is trying to emphasize that one should be in any one versus another. I remember Matthew Fox who is a contemporary spiritual teacher, who claims that the coolest thing on his resume is that he was personally fired by the Pope. He was he was a priest who was doing all-night raves in San Francisco in the basement of St. Mark's Cathedral there, and basically he was told to stop because it was not okay. But his thing was he was keeping kids who would be doing drugs on the street, all night in a place that was safe, and that was and so anyhow he got fired over it. But Matthew Fox says this. He says, it doesn't matter where you dig the well, you get to the same water. So let's just start out with that, because in this day and age, excuse me, in this particular day and age, it seems so much energy is aimed at making us feel divided from everything or everyone else. And so this is not about that. I just wanted to be really clear about that. But something happened about 2,000 years ago. And of course, in astrology, what we want to do is we want to make a chart. Now, until Johannes Kepler came along, there was no way that any modern person could make a chart, because we did not have the formulas for the mathematical logistics of how the planets moved. So there was no way to say, erect a chart for January 23rd, 1471. It was impossible. There was no tool to do it. But with Kepler's laws of motion, and of course, Kepler, as we know, was not an astronomer. He was the Emperor Rudolph's Mathematicus, and the Mathematicus was a formal job title of the timekeeper. He was the emperor's astrologer. Now, there's a whole dive around Johannes Kepler that we can do sometime, because his story and his life is so fascinating, and he's often held up by modern scientists as being the father of modern astronomy, who, like many ignorant, superstitious people of his time, dabbled in astrology, but he didn't believe it. We have words of his that said, that show he didn't believe in it, even though he did it for money. And nothing could be further from the truth, because in fact, the astrology that Johannes Kepler didn't believe in was the astrology that just ticked him off. And it had to do with the emperor wanting to know when to go to war and when he was or wasn't going to get laid. That was the astrology of that time, just like it's the astrology of these times. That's not the astrology that we are doing. But Kepler actually, in figuring out the laws of planetary motion, without a computer, he had a pencil, or probably a rural pen, a feather with ink in it or something, maybe a writing device, and he scratched on paper using his formulas, and he could figure out when the last conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn were, and when the one before that was, and when the one before that was. And he did this in 1602, 1603, somewhere in there. And he went all the way back, and he realized that there was a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in the sign of Pisces in 7 BC. And he wondered if that wasn't in some way connected with the Star of Bethlehem. Now, it's important to understand that that Kepler was a religious man, meaning that he was a member of the Protestant church, the Protestant church, that in some ways was at war with the Catholic Church during those times. This is after the beginning of the Reformation, the Reformation, and Kepler was somewhat caught in the middle, but he worked for Emperor Rudolph, and Emperor Rudolph was the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, which broke away from the Pope. So Kepler, who didn't want to get caught up in religious controversies, still very much believed in the idea of the creator and of God, and that his work as an astrologer, as someone who was delving into the mysteries, Kepler is the first human being who extended humans' intellect into the celestial realm. We can't, as moderners, we can't grasp that. No one, anything outside of the earth plane was always considered to be of divine proportion. It was considered to be divine, heavenly. That's what it was. And Kepler had the audacity to stick his head through, you've seen that woodcut, that ancient woodcut. Well, that was Kepler kind of looking up and going, holy smokes, we can put our brains up here. And so it's very important to understand this picture in which we are looking at the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. But Kepler was very humbled when he realized that there may actually have been an astronomical component to the Star of Bethlehem. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves because we need to put up front something very, very important. And that is that no one will ever have the chart for the birth of Jesus, the historical Jesus. There are many different theories about what the Star of Bethlehem was. And some of them are quite interesting. There was a comet in 12 BC, and some people said that. There was a possible supernova in 5 BC. And in fact, there was a very interesting sequence of visible events between 3 BC and 1 BC that many people say was the Christmas star. And in fact, this is favored a bit by Christian theologians. And I've puzzled for years as to why. And I think I know the answer. And I think it's because it's safer. Because it doesn't pull in the astrological component as strongly. And just to touch on that, to give it the respect that it is due, because it is a theory and we'll never know. It's not the one that I'm going to dig down into. But there was a very interesting series of conjunctions between Venus and Jupiter. Roughly in, I think, 2 BC, Venus went retrograde, and it did it in the sign of Virgo, and there's this whole thing about chasing the lion, which is the Leo, which would have been the previous sign, and so in a way there's this whole mythology built up around the idea of the Star of Bethlehem being this conjunction of Jupiter and Venus, which were very visible, but unless you were looking for it, you wouldn't notice it. Remember, when the wise men, and we're going to come back to these dudes in just a minute because they're such an important piece of the story, but when the wise men were searching for the fulfillment of this sign that they saw, Herod, was freaking out because he didn't want a king of kings to be born. He was the king. And so he brought the Magi, the wise men, to his castle, not his castle, his home. I don't know. What do you call it?
Palace.
Huh?
Is palace?
Thank you. That's the word. And he basically said, show me this star so I can worship it too. It was a bit of a scam, but the wise men took him out at night and showed him the star, and he went, oh, holy crap, I see it. So what is it that, if there's any truth to these stories, what is it that you could see but not see until someone showed it to you? And I can't tell you how many times I've been out at night, and said to someone, hey, you see that brightest thing up there? That's Mars, or that's Mars joining up with the moon. And the person goes, oh my God, I've never seen that before. It's like we see things, but we don't see things. So let's go back to, I think it's Matthew, where it said, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem, in the days of Herod the king, this is an important dating feature. Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? And this is and in Matthew it says, for we have seen his star rising in the east and have come to worship him. Now, worship, I mean, all of this is translations of translations, so we don't know exactly what, but worship him might have simply meant to honor him or to pay homage to him. But there's another series of words in here that's translated that has a very powerful meaning that is totally lost to us moderners. And that is, for we saw his star in the east, or we saw his star rising in the east. Now, to us, that just means there's the eastern horizon and we saw the star rising. But to the ancients, the way they kept track of time over the year was by noticing what stars were rising in the east before it came light at dawn. You see, because over the course of a year, if the earth is moving around the sun once a year, it looks like the sun moves around the entire zodiac once a year. The sun isn't, but that's what it looks like, which means that if you were to watch the sunrise every day for a year, you would see every sign in the zodiac rising just before the sun rose. Mm. And the term for that is heliacal rising. And in the Aramaic, which is what the Gospels were written in prior to being translated to Greek, prior to being translated to Latin, to English, and probably distorted again and again and again and again. I remember Rob Hand once saying that fundamentalism is a system of belief that's based upon a misinterpretation of a bad translation of an allegedly divinely inspired piece of writing. It's a brilliant definition. So to the ancients, this concept of heliacal rising, because in the Aramaic, it was we have seen his star in heliacal rising. Now that's something that means something very different, because that means it was close to the sun. It means that it was rising and then the sun was coming up. And it turns out that the Magi were a very particular titled group of people. And here again, we have translations that just don't quite do it. I mean, we all know that there were these three Magi. In some cases, they're called the wise men. In some cases, in older songs, they're even referred to as kings. We three kings of Orient are. Orient means east, and these three kings or wise men or magi came from the east. Well, what was the east? Well, today, east of Jerusalem is Iraq. At that time, it was called Babylonia. And Persia, actually. It was Babylonia even prior to that. And the predominant religion of what would be called the Orient to people living in the area of Israel or Palestine, that area would be to the Orient. It would be Oriental. It would be to the east. And in the east, the religion that they practiced was a religion called Zoroastrianism. This was the predominant religion of the time. And Zoroastrianism was based upon the works of their prophet Zoroaster, who lived a few centuries prior to that. And this was the widespread religion. And in fact, in many religions, there's a title given to the priests of that religion. Like if someone had the title Rabbi Joel Goldstein, to pick a name that sounds Jewish. I don't even know if there is a rabbi by that name. But if someone has the word rabbi as part of their title, or is referred to as, yes, he or she is a rabbi, that means that that person is a minister of the spiritual tradition contained within the church, within the religion of Judaism. That's what a rabbi is. There's no question about it at all. If you use the word rabbi, you know what it is. In fact, if someone uses the word priest, it usually in our culture refers to someone who is in the same role, but in the Church of Catholicism. That in the Protestant world, they are called ministers or reverend, but not priests. Now, it turns out that a magi was a title just like a rabbi, and a magi. And magi actually technically, I think, is plural. I think magus is the singular, but we use it in both ways. But a magi was a Zoroastrian priest, and these Zoroastrian priests were not subservient. They were like kings because they were venerated. There was very little division of church and state like there allegedly should be in the United States because it's written into our Constitution. There's another rabbit hole to go down sometime, but not today. So these, apparently, these three magi were in fact Zoroastrian priests and kings in their own right. Now, it turns out that there's a guy, I want to say his name was John Roberts. I might have his name wrong. I haven't looked at this book in years, but I read it many years ago. This guy basically was a historian, and he was interested in trying to figure out really what happened back around the birth of Jesus. And he figured that if there was truth to this story that is recorded in the Christian tradition as three magi coming from the East, paying homage to this birth of an avatar of a new age, the age of Christianity. And let's hold that thought that we refer to what many astrologers call the age of Pisces, is often referred to as the age of Christianity. In fact, until more recently, even in academics, it was BC, before Christ, and the AD is Anno Domino, which is the year of our Lord. I mean, this is how we refer to the timekeeping that we do. I mean, AD means, the year of the Lord. It's after the birth of Jesus. We'll come back to that in a moment. But this guy decided or concluded that if there was truth to this story, that he should be able to find somewhere in modern day Iraq remnants of some local stories of something about these three kings who went on a journey for a year and came back. And he did. And it's a very interesting story because he unfolds his story kind of as his own travel log, going into these little towns and trying to put these pieces together, and going into church records and listening to local stories and so on. And it turns out that, like many of our religious stories, like Joshua fitting the Battle of Jericho, and in the Bible, in the Old Testament, in the Torah, it is said that Joshua held the sun to stand still. He asked God to make the sun stand still because there was a battle going on, and they needed more time for the then Jews to be victorious in the battle. And so that's recorded in the Old Testament. Now, it turns out from the same time in history, there are myths in China and in Japan and in the South Sea Islands of a period of extended night. You see, what we get as mythological stories actually seem to have truth, although they're wrapped up in religious symbolism, which I have to say, in my mind, doesn't take anything away from them. It just makes them even more magical. And there's another story here that I can't do this without even mentioning. But this is an hour or two or three discussion itself. Do you know the name Immanuel Velikovsky?
I do not.
All right. So Immanuel Velikovsky was the victim of probably one of the largest publishing, what's the right word, events, crises, chaotic moments in the 20th century, because he was a Russian Jew who got a PhD in geology, studied psychoanalysis, came to the United States, was a friend of Albert Einstein's, but was an intellectual. And he began to delve into cross-cultural mythologies from a standpoint, actually, of a psychoanalytic perspective, because it began to dawn on him that what was called the Great Flood in the Old Testament, that was that same myth of a huge deluge existed in just about every culture around the world, whether it was in the southern tip of Africa or in the northern tip of Japan. It didn't matter, that this was somehow ingrained. And he began to think that these great events were actually like traumatic events in our childhood that are so painful we block them out. This is a kind of a psychological, psychoanalytical thing. And he said, this is the same thing true with our history. We have these moments that are so overwhelming that we turn them into stories, but we make them other than natural and we can't deal with them. And in fact, one of the key components, so anyhow, Velikovsky wrote 3 books, which overnight became New York Times bestsellers. This is in the early 50s. I think it might have been around 1953 or 54. My year might be off here. I'm doing all this from memory. So these books became overnight bestsellers. The books were Worlds in Collision, which is, if you're going to read one, read that one, Ages in Chaos, and Earth in Upheaval. And if you can gather by the names of these books, they're all about the historical background of Earth based upon cataclysm. And one of the major cataclysms that's discussed in Worlds in Collision is the period of time of what in the Old Testament is the Jewish exodus from Egypt, the holiday of Passover, Moses, that whole period of time where there were plagues and the Red Sea parting and all of that. Well, Velikovsky claims that that was because Venus, which had previously been a moon of Jupiter, was knocked out of orbit, became a comet that had a near collision with Earth every 79 years, which is why the prophets in the Old Testament were forecasting the doom of Earth every 79 years, because of this fear of being colliding with what now we know is Venus. And that around the time of the Exodus, which is around 1800 BC, I may be off here 100 years or so, but around that time, Venus coming into its closest approach to the sun, actually moving in the same direction as Earth, had a long-term near collision with Earth where their atmospheres actually melded and Venus settled into its orbit. And Velikovsky predicted in 1952-53 that Venus was way hotter, that what we would find that Venus is way hotter than it should be because it was a burning comet, and that its atmosphere would be acidic and hydrocarbonous. He claimed that the mana that the Jews ate in the morning as precipitation were actually hydrocarbons that precipitated into our atmosphere from Venus, and that the pillar of fire at night and the pillar of smoke during the day was this comet that was so close to Earth that it was like right there, and that even the parting of the Red Sea was because gravity was all screwed up, and that the water actually... Now, this all sounds like an aside, but it's not, because these books were so incredibly powerful, informational, and convincing that they became bestsellers. And it was published by the largest college textbook publishing company in the country. That was Macmillan. And the Southern universities, we're talking the big Southern universities, the University of Georgia, the University of Alabama, basically said these books are heresy. And if these books aren't pulled out of circulation immediately, we will never buy another Macmillan textbook ever. And overnight, all 3 books disappeared.
Hey there, it's Amanda here, and I hope you're loving this episode. I just wanted to pop in with a very special invitation for you. We are hosting our 10th annual Year Ahead Forecast event on January 20th and 21st. This is a donation-based, pay-as-you-wish event featuring some of the world's top astrologers, including Adam Ellenboss, Penny Thornton, Gemini Brett, Rebecca Gordon, and more. Over the course of 2 days, you will get clarity on the major transits shaping 2026 and how they ripple into 2027, how to take advantage of the opportunities that arise during times of big change, how to prepare for some of the most defining transits of our entire lifetime, and you're going to get insights on the hot spots of the year that you can put into your calendar. Together, we will explore the must-know transits and energies of 2026 so you can move into the new year feeling clear, confident, and aligned. Save your spot today at astrologyhub.com/2026 forecast. We will also put that link in the show notes. And now, back to the episode.
It's a great story. And they eventually were republished, I think Random House or I'm not sure, but they were eventually republished a year or so later, and they're still around. But it's the power of the fear that what is called a miracle might actually be something that really happened. Now, again, many people read these, and even many Christian theologians read these books and said, this is amazing because the magic is even greater than we thought, because it really did happen and there were reasons and all this stuff came together. So I wanted to say that as precedent as we talk about this thing that every year captures our imagination. And I would say no matter what our religion is, we're still caught up by the imagery of what this magic of this moment, of the potential, of the hope, of the innocence of this star that led people to make a journey to honor a baby who was born, who was innocent, who then basically took on the position of avatar or spiritual guru or messiah for an entire age. And we'll hold that word age because we're going to come back to that in a moment. But can you kind of see where I'm coming at all this from?
Yes, absolutely. And you had left us off at the guy who went to Iraq and found the stories.
Yeah, and there really wasn't much more there other than there was a story. And the story was around that same time. And that these 3 kings actually did, with their trail of camels and servants, basically make this journey to find this person to fulfill the event that they saw that had to do with the symbol of this star that they saw. Now, so what did they see? And why were they even looking? So let's just take a quick meander through the understanding of what Zoroastrianism is. And I like to say that Zoroastrianism, to a large extent, is founded on the belief that events on earth are foretold and or seen in the heavens. And I would like to say that that same thing is a foundation of Christianity, except most Christians are in denial. And I don't mean that on a personal level. What I mean is that the Lord's Prayer says, "It is done on earth as it is in heaven." Those are the words in the Lord's Prayer. And yet most Christians do not believe in astrology because they think that it's not okay to believe that it's done on earth as it is in heaven, even though they say those same words every day, if they say the Lord's Prayer every day. Now, Zoroastrianism actually was built on that same premise, but looking at the heavens then wasn't like looking at the heavens now. Obviously, they couldn't put in a birth date, place, time, hit enter, and boom, have a chart. They didn't have the understanding of a lot of the planets that we know that exist now that they didn't know because they only had the naked eye. However, and they also didn't work in the same way that we do with transits and progressions and aspects. They were often omen oriented. They looked at events as omens, eclipses being a good example, seeing as how we are just exiting a season of eclipses. But the Zoroastrian temples were called ziggurats. Does that name mean anything to you? A ziggurat?
No.
Well, a ziggurat, and I assume, I'm not going to Google it, but I assumed that if you Google ziggurat, and it's maybe Ziggar, ziggurat, I think it's obviously a translation from Arabic or Persian, or but a ziggurat, we've all seen them, and what they are is they are the old Zoroastrian temples that were often 3 or 4 stories tall, that were stepped. They weren't like pyramids, but they were like each, until at the very top, there was like an observatory. And you often see a picture of someone in a robe looking through a telescope. Of course, there were no telescopes then, but the image is that these were priests who were in their temples that were actually observatories, because they knew that what happened up there is what was happening down here. This is what the Magi were. In some translations that are more correct, instead of using the word Magi or wise men, in some translations the word astrologer-priests are used. And they were astrologer priests. That's what a Zoroastrian priest was. That's what a Magi was, an astrologer priest. So here they are looking at the sky. And of course, to the ancients, the timekeepers of the heavens were the slowest moving things up there, which were Jupiter and Saturn. They didn't have Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, Eris, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and and whatever else, and 10,000 or 20,000 asteroids and so on. They basically had what we would call the 7 visible planets. Of course, we include the sun and the moon in that, but Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And Jupiter and Saturn were the heavyweights because they moved so slowly. And in fact, the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn was an event that these Magi, these astrologer priests, knew well. In fact, this is where the concept of grand conjunction comes from, because there is mythology around, and I've dug on this. I have to admit that I found many references to this, but I can't find verifiable proof. So, but I can say this because I'm not an academic and I'm really just telling a story. But it turns out that the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction to the ancient Jews was considered to be they referred to that as the king star. You see, now understand that to the ancients, the planets were stars. It's not like there are stars and there are planets. The word planeta in Greek simply means wanderer. The planets were simply stars that wandered. So if you're looking at Jupiter 2,000 years ago, you're looking at a star. Okay, we moderners somehow just forget that. Now, every 20 years, when Jupiter, who was the king of Olympus, I mean, Jupiter was a serious dude, and and Saturn was even more serious. Saturn was Chronos. Saturn was Father Time, and in fact, to the Jews, Saturn took even greater importance than anything else, which is in fact why the Jews chose to worship and to be quiet on Saturn Day rather than Sunday or Moon Day or Mars Day or Venus Day or Jupiter Day. I mean, and so Saturn was like, it was like the end of the road. They didn't use the word karma, but Saturn was the end of the road. It was the great timekeeper. So when Jupiter every 20 years lined up with Saturn, to them, that was the great timekeeper in the sky. Now, they noticed that every 20 years that this conjunction occurred in the same elements. They had elements like we do, fire, earth, air, water, and that they also had associations from the various signs to different countries and peoples and things. And in fact, the sign of Pisces was considered to be the sign of the Jews, the sign of Canaan, or then Palestine. So these magi are watching the skies at night, and they're seeing Jupiter and Saturn over the course of years coming closer together. Now, obviously, you can see it for several months, and then it goes into the sun and you can't, and then they're closer together. But they're seeing this, and they're thinking, holy smokes, this conjunction is coming together. But unlike the past conjunctions that were in air, this one is going to be in water. In fact, this one's going to be in the sign of Pisces. This king star, which is what they called the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, is going to occur in the sign of the Jews. The new king of kings for the Jews, the king of Jews, will be born. This is a big deal. And hence the mythology of these three kings going to find the person to fulfill the imagery. Now, here I have to take a quick aside and tell a personal story, because for me, this locked this whole thing into place. Many years ago, maybe about 35 years ago, I went to hear this guy whose name was Nagpa Chogyam Rinpoche, just an amazing creature, a Brit who had spent 20 years in the caves of Bhutan, was given a true, real Vajrayana lineage, and could speak English better than most of the people who were listening. And this guy was brilliant. And I had the privilege of hearing him several times. And he really was like, he had something very, very special about him. He wrote a book. A couple of years later, I found a book of his. He has a couple of books out there, by the way, and they're both worth reading. But he has a third book that's out of print. And this book was an unauthorized biography of the 14th Dalai Lama, the current Dalai Lama. And the first chapter of the book is the story of the previous Dalai Lama's last days, his death, and the few years after his death, and the search for the new Dalai Lama. And as I read this, I freaked out because it felt like the three wise men looking for Jesus. It was like, this is all too weird. And it wasn't intended to be that at all, but because I was already immersed in this research, because I grew up as an outsider. I grew up, in the Jewish tradition, surrounded by friends who celebrated Christmas, and Christmas quickly became my favorite holiday. I loved the idea of the Christmas star, even before I had any inklings of what astrology was. And so this is something that, when I talk about this whole concept, none of this is new to me. I've been researching and digging into this for probably 35, 40 years. But when I read, or more than that, but when I read his story, it was like these three, what's the right word? Aides, associates, disciples, I don't know, of the previous Dalai Lama, basically they were putting the word out. If anyone comes across anyone that seems to be different or special, we're on the hunt, because, and this was about 2-3 years after the Dalai Lama left his body. And they got word that in some little tiny town outside of some little town outside of some non-existent town, who knows where, somewhere in Tibet, that there was some kid that people were talking about. And so these three guys basically packed up and went on a journey to this town to see if this was the Dalai Lama. And the story is that, and this would have taken place in the 1930s. I don't have the exact date of the Dalai Lama, but he was born somewhere in the early 30s. When these three Buddhist monks get to this town, and they're directed to the home, they have with them 3 walking sticks that all look the same, but one of them was the property of the Dalai Lamas, and the other 2 were just walking sticks. And anyhow, they get into, they find the house, and when they get to the house, there's a 3-year-old there who's all dressed up as if he's going to a celebration. And the parents basically said he insisted on getting dressed up today. He knew it was a special day. So it was like he was waiting. And in fact, the story is, and I can't validate this, I'm just telling you what this story is that I read, that this 3-year-old was able to converse with these 3 monks in a different dialect than the dialect that the 3 or 4-year-old was learning locally. And he quickly pushed aside the other 2 walking sticks and basically said, mine, right one. Now, there's something about the idea of reincarnation, which we have talked about here before, and this idea of somehow the soul surviving death and incarnating, disincarnating, incarnating, disincarnating. And there was something about the Jewish belief of the king star, of what we call the grand conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, that basically anyone born under the king star was considered to be in the lineage of the house of David. Hold that thought just for a second, because now we have someone in 1930 who is born into the lineage of the Dalai Lama. We're not talking genetics here. We're talking some sort of metaphysical, spiritual lineage that basically says this person has the genes, even though they're not familial, they're not from the family of this other person. There's something here that's vibrationally recurring or contiguous. And so to the ancients, being born under a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction was a sign of being born into the house of David. It was the king star. And now you have this moment where the Zoroastrians, who know all this mythology, because they were not, even though it was a separate religion, they were scholars. And they understood that this conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn was like an omen, because they were very omen oriented. And they went out to find the fulfillment of this omen in an incarnation. And that then brings us to their journey to the east, because it was rising in the east. It was in heliacal rising. And so, of course, they went east. And now there is a very, like I said, in all fairness, I wanted to mention this. There is a large group of people who believe that the time that Jesus was born was actually in 2 BC. And part of this is confusing because the way we time his ancient prehistorical events or early historical events is through dates that we know and or astrological phenomena like eclipses. And so we know that there was a tax collection. We know that Herod was alive, that there is basically there's disagreement. There's many people that say that Herod didn't die until 1 BC, but most records show that he died around 4 BC. Now, the problem is further compounded by the fact that and actually, I can get this date here really quickly, I think, because what happened was that the Pope needed to set the date for the Star of David. And and the idea of the tax collection was every 14 years, half of a Saturn cycle. But the fact of the matter is that around 530 AD, and that of course is the year of our Lord, the Pope assigned to a monk named Dionysius Exiguus the task for setting the date of the origin of the calendar. The calendar was to begin with the birth of Jesus. Unfortunately, Dionysius wasn't up for the task. It might have been one of the more important stupid people that we know about, because first of all, he assigned the year 1 to the time of the birth, but in Roman numerals, I think we've talked about this here before, there's no 0. So somehow he missed the fact that there was a year 0. So he was immediately off a year because that was the year 1. And then secondly, he basically researched and uncovered a 400-year chronology that showed that Jesus was born during the reign of Caesar Augustus. And he figured out that the 28th year of the reign of Augustus was when Jesus was born, but he missed the fact that Augustus and Octavius were the same person. He thought they were different people. That Octavius basically was Augustus with a changed name for 4 years. And so with that miscalculation, we immediately go back to 5 or 6 BC. And then it turns out that this conjunction was in 7 BC, which is when it's really likely. Now, the other piece of this is that the Roman Empire's tax collection, which occurred about every 14 years, there was a historian who lived a generation after Jesus, a Roman historian named Josephus. And he recalled that there was a tax collection in 8 BC. And the thing about tax collections is it didn't matter where you were, you had to go to your home where you were born. And Joseph was of the tribe of David, born in Bethlehem, and that was his hometown. And so it may have taken him weeks or even months, but he had to go back to Bethlehem to be there for the tax, accounting, and therefore that chronology places Joseph and Mary in Bethlehem around 8 BC. So that's kind of a little piece of this. And so it turns out that that if we are to believe this chronology, which puts a heavy emphasis on the astrological origins of Christianity versus the 2 BC chronology, which is about the very visible conjunction of Venus and Jupiter, which would have been much brighter because they actually were close enough, like this one is, that to the naked eye, they would have appeared as one star unless you looked at it really carefully. It's very possible. It's just that since I am, like our dear friend Gemini Brett, I'm a storyteller, and this is my starry story. And we can never prove which one is right, but it's my sense that this story is more threatening to the origins of Christianity being logical, being astrological, than the you see, the Venus Jupiter conjunction occurs every 2 years. And it doesn't have that whole connection with being of the house of David, the King of Kings, this connection of the importance that we've talked about even here in our last talk about the expansion contraction cycles, of that Jupiter Saturn conjunction cycle that happens every 20 years. So here now, coming up to date, and I have to say that every year for the past, well, actually, I know because I began doing this the year my daughter was born, which is right around the time you were born. And that is that I've been writing a poem, or I did for about 25 years, every year around the solstice. And when we get to the end, I'm going to close with one that is from a few years ago, but has particular resonance to right now. Because around this time of year, again, regardless of whether you celebrate Kwanzaa, Hanukkah, the solstice, Christmas, if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, the days get darker. And the idea of the long night and even the pre-Judeo-Christian, the pagan, the earth religions, and understanding just the attachment to the darkening of the light and the fear that the light won't return. And then Christmas representing the hope of the light coming back, whether it's every year or whether it's culturally or civilization-wise, that the light coming back through some teacher who has the truth that may get us back on track. It's all part of the same. It's all part of the same story. So for many years, I would write around this time of year a poem, and I think it might have been in about 1994, 1993, 94, somewhere right in there. The now late, great Noel Till, astrologer who passed a year ago now, convinced me that I needed to take all of my poems and put them together and put it into a book, which I did. It was a limited edition. They were signed and numbered. I have like a few copies left. They're not for sale. But the motion of every year now for 40 years of going through this process of trying to reframe, re-understand, look at modern times, what's the same, what's different. And every year I do this, but this year is different. And this year is different for a few reasons. The primary reason is that this year there is a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, which happened back in 2001, which happened, but not on Christmas, which happened in 1980, but not on Christmas. This one is happening, okay, it's not on Christmas, but it's within a few days of Christmas. The Romans celebrated the solstice on December 25th. They did not celebrate the solstice on the 21st. In fact, we think in our minds that that Christmas is a replacement for the Saturnalia, an interesting holiday that is oriented around the beginning of the sun in Capricorn. But the Saturnalia was actually before what they called the solstice, which was on December 25th. Anyhow, this idea that this Christmas star, that this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction is so close to Christmas, is on the day of the solstice, is in itself a little mind-boggling. It's the first time any of us will have this happen. And I am one of those astrologers that hates, okay, that's maybe strong, strongly dislikes. It makes the hair on my back, and yes, I do have hair on my back. It makes the hair on my back stand up on end when I read something that in any astrological page says, this is the first time this has happened in 37,000 years. This hasn't happened in 265 years. This is so rare, it hasn't happened since yesterday. I mean, we get carried away with the importance of things happening in our lifetime. Like I must say, this whole thing about the age of Aquarius, going back 200 years, we have people who believe that the new age starts during their lifetime, because that's what we do. We like to think that that we're going to be special, we're going to be here when the end of the world is here, or when the beginning of the kingdom of God arrives, or whatever. And unfortunately, there's a whole lot of mixed up mythology around the beginning of the age of Aquarius. And without going too deeply into that right now, I just want to say, finding the moment of the beginning of the age of Aquarius is like finding a chart for the birth of Jesus. You can't do it, because there's no way that we'll ever know. And in order to find the exact moment of the beginning of the age of Aquarius, as if a cycle nearly 26,000 years long can have a finite moment in time where something switches to something else, which is kind of ridiculous, the cusp between ages is probably a good couple of 100 years long. Think about that, I mean, normally when we think about our signs, we give the cusp a day or so on either side between two signs, but that's over 1 year rather than a cycle that is over 26,000 years. And so this idea of the age of Aquarius began in October of 1923 or in February of 1963 or tomorrow is just simply an act of ignorance. It's what we call overplaying the card of the margin of error. There's more error involved than we can. It's like we bounce around on the inside of the most accurate that we can be. We don't know. And the real problem then becomes affixing a day of the beginning of the age of Pisces. If we could give a beginning point to the age of Pisces, then we could come up with an approximately, accurate beginning point of the age of Aquarius. And it's my contention, although I've read people who say, oh, the age of Aquarius obviously began with the flight of the first airplane at Kitty Hawk, or the advent of the computer and the internet, or the invention of electricity and Tesla, or of the French Revolution and all these dates are used as dates to prove that this is the beginning of the age of Aquarius. Well, that's almost as dumb as saying I'm tall and skinny and like to read, therefore I'm a Gemini. We can't backwards engineer something based upon one symptom or even a few, observations. The fact of the matter is that if we take the tack that the Star of Bethlehem in some way was the herald, hark, the herald angels sing, that the three kings from Orient are who followed the star to actually honor and create this event that was the beginning of what we call the age of Christianity, although in modern academic times we've changed it to mean the common era, and that's era, not error, and that what we call the common era, we are in the 2021st year of this era. Well, I'm sorry, but I don't need a whole lot more measuring than the fact that this is the tool that we've been using to measure this era or age for several hundred centuries. And so, I'm not saying that the age of Pisces began on the day that Jesus was born. We don't know the day he was born. We don't even know the year he was born. And I'm not even a Christian, although I certainly adhere to many of the teachings of Jesus. And I think it was Soren Kierkegaard who made the absolute distinction between the Church of Christ and the teachings of Christ. Two very different things. They have, unfortunately, very little in common sometimes. Regardless, the fact of the matter is that the best marker that we have for the beginning of the age of Pisces, the fish, multiplicity, the dividing of the loaves, multiplicity, the healing through the divine intervention through the priest, where the symbols of Pisces, the fish moving in two opposite directions, connected by a golden thread that's reserved for the priesthood, the mystical. In the age of Aquarius, everyone gets it. Look, everyone does not enter the new age at the same time. There are people who enter a new way of thinking or being 200, 300 years prior. And there are those who enter 200 or 300 years later. This is the difference between being a prophet and a slow learner. And so I'm not suggesting that the age of Aquarius has not arrived metaphysically for some people. But if you do the math, it's very, very simple. And that is that it takes basically 1 degree of precession occurs every 72 years. 1 degree of precession occurs every 72 years, which means that if you're using a division of the zodiac based by 12, meaning that there are 30 degrees in each sign, that 30 times 72 is 2,160 years. What that means is that the age of Aquarius theoretically should begin 2,160 years after the beginning. And I just want to say for the people who are watching, Amanda has a slow internet connection, and she just froze, but she did not leave her body during those moments. Anyhow, if one were to use the simple, straightforward math and say that the birth of Jesus was the moment of the beginning of the age of Aquarius, then we would say that the age of Pisces, we would say the age of Pisces began in 7 BC, which would mean that we have 2,153 years AD to get to before we reach the age of Aquarius, which means that we're a good 130 years away from actually the transition of the ages. Now, does this mean that we're not getting glimpses? Does this mean that every time we get an Aquarian buzz, like we did back in February of 1962, or like we did during the conjunctions of Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune in 89 through 94, 95, we're getting buzzes, we're getting glimpses, we're getting like harmonic overtones. But this is not the age. An age has nothing to do with the movement of the planets around the zodiac, period. Anyone who's saying that it's devised from that doesn't understand that an age is a phenomenon based upon the backward wobble of Earth. That's a 26,000, actually, it's a little bit less than 26,000 years as the Earth wobbles around, creating what we call the precession of the equinox. Enough there. We can't talk about the Christmas star without saying that, yes, this is a very special event. Yes, this relates back to what happened 2027 years ago. But no, this is not a moment where we are now all of a sudden in an age of Aquarius, that we have another century most likely to go. And yet, whatever belief you hold, I'm not going to change your mind, even if you're wrong.
Okay. So in summary, Rick, and actually it's funny because every time I receive an email or hear someone talking about this, I think of you, and I think of you just cringing and really trying to make the point about why this is not actually a pinpointed moment where we're going to the age of Aquarius. And it makes me smile. And you make great points, and it makes a lot of sense. So basically what you're saying is that the echo of the event that is the Star of Bethlehem, that the 3 wise men or the 3 kings, with 3 priests, magi, were following. The significance of that one versus the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction that happens every 20 years is that it was a shift in element.
That's
So
right. It was not only a grand conjunction, it was a great mutation, which is
exactly.
the once every 200-year shifting. And people are saying this is a once in 800-year event. Yes, it was 800 years ago approximately that we had the air element, but it's really a 2 century cycling of shifting roughly. And it's not exactly that. This one turns out to be more like 160 years. And one other thing is that even if you're using that, this isn't the mutation. The mutation occurred in 1980. There was a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in 1980, in air signs, in Libra, and then it backed up into Earth, and now it's in Libra. But technically, this is not the mutation. That was. But even still, this kind of confirms it. It's like when it's like when Saturn moved into Aquarius, earlier this year, back into Capricorn. Now it's really in Aquarius.
Right. Okay. So a similar thing was happening then.
Yes.
It was going into water.
Pisces.
It went into Pisces from air into water, went into Pisces. And that was the quote unquote house of David, or that was the sign associated with
the Jews.
The Jews.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's why they were saying that the king of the Jews is going to be born.
Yeah, and that was actually what it says in Matthew. I mean, the line is, where is he who has been born king of the Jews?
Right.
I mean, it's not said pejoratively. That's what it was.
Right. So there's good reason to believe that it was a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, that it was the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction that moved into Pisces. There's other theories that it could have been Jupiter and Venus conjunct in 2 BC, but that happens every 2 years.
Yeah, but there are extenuating circumstances about that one, and I don't want to take that off the table. It just doesn't seem as likely to me.
Okay, possible, but maybe not.
We don't know.
And you're saying that the explanation that it was Jupiter and Saturn is a little bit more threatening because it is more astrologically based than the other theories.
The other one is more astronomically based and visual, and this has the wiring into the whole component. I mean, I've said it to a number of people, who have kind of chastised me for being an astrologer, and how the Bible says you shouldn't do astrology. And my answer is, it's odd to me that Jesus only invited 3 outsiders, aside from the shepherds who happened to have been around. He only invited 3 non-family members to the birth, and they were all astrologers. Did he know something you don't know? Right.
Okay. All right. I have one more question for you.
Again, your video is frozen, but we can hear you fine.
Okay, good. Back. All right. Well, hopefully I'm not doing something really weird. Is this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction happening on the solstice? I asked you this 2 weeks ago. I don't know if you were able to look into it. Has the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction ever happened on the solstice?
Maybe, but not in recent history.
Recent history, like within 800
years?
Couple hundred years. Okay. Yeah. And so theoretically there is, I know we want there to be significance. And I think after this year, it feels like there is significance. And I hear what you're saying about everyone playing up the time that they're living in. But would you say that there is extra significance to it happening on the solstice?
Yes. Yeah, because the solstices are the cross quarters. Those are Saturn's points. Those are the 90-degree angles where physical reality manifests. This is something we delved into very deeply in module 1 of the Astrology Foundations course as to why the cardinal cross, and again, I did this, I felt very Catholic in this moment, that this motion is basically delineating the 90-degree angle. That's the top part of Saturn and the bottom part of Jupiter. That 90-degree angle is the cross of material world. The word cardinal actually comes from the Latin word cardo, which means hinge. And a hinge basically is something that doesn't move, even though everything else does. It's why the cardinals were given the name cardinals, because even though the politics of the times changed, they held their position. And so, yes, it's very significant that it occurs on a cardinal point. Absolutely.
Okay, well, I'm going with the Christmas star and the Star of the Bethlehem, and this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction being very, very similar in tone and potential significance. And it's super interesting, and we'll see what happens.
Yes. And if we have reached our end point, I would like to close with a poem.
Yes, please.
And I think in some ways it will summarize a lot of what we said. There are a few historical references in here that may feel like they're from a few years ago, and they are, but it's basically current. Are we ready? Shall I?
Oh, yes, please.
This is the most precious time of year, when nights get long, dark, deep, and clear. Spirits soar, hearts open wide, when in the north the sun does hide. We see the frozen countryside. It seems like natural beauty has died. The flowers once blossomed, now gone to their grave. With winter's arrival, we must all be brave, for in winter so cold, so dark, and so deep, memories of flowers are hard to keep. But cycles are endless, they keep spinning around. The sun will return to warm up the ground, and the beautiful blossoms now gone from our view will return from their graves to be reborn anew. So at this most precious time of year, for flowers passed on, shed not a tear. Feel not sorrow for what now is gone, and remember that time must always move on. Now, as the sun sets early each day, we may fear that it has gone away, but cycles are endless. We keep spinning around. The sun will return to warm up the ground. And at this time of year, we look back on our past to remember a time when the earth seemed so vast, a time when the skies were reserved for the birds, the dreams of a few and the flight of their words, a time when a star shined so brightly to some who journeyed afar. To his birth they did come, bearing gifts of spirit, for the birth of a child, an innocent babe midst times, oh, so wild. We remember that time when he walked here on earth, his remnants now tied to a dying old church that invests its riches rather than helping the poor, that holds on to a structure so sick at the core, that teaches intolerance, that closes the door while politicians and generals plan the next war. This holiday season is more precious than some. The events of our time have made us quite numb. We can see the hypocrisy each day on the news, regardless of differing political views. But shed not a tear for the death of a child, a casualty of these times so wild, where children of Palestine and Israel suffer while leaders are asleep at the wheel. What meaning in Afghanistan has peace on earth, goodwill to man? Do innocent families bombed in Iraq deserve the brunt of our lethal attack? We send our soldiers and our missiles of hate. Can we change this trend before it's too late? In freedom's name, we mount a global attack to the needy at home, we just turn our back. We live in the richest nation on earth, but don't stop to think or to see what it's worth. We've taken the magic of solstice and turned it around till the ring of a cash sale is the most holy sound. But there's a flame of awareness now alive in the land that sparks freedom of thought, even where banned. And banned it is, for it's disruptive to those who play on our fears while their profit grows. Stupidity and hate and short-sighted greed rule some who now rule, but it's not what we need. We don't need profits from oil to pay for our wars. We don't need to lock freedom behind closed doors. We don't need to hide from the truth anymore that we've become our very own prisoners of war, but a war on terror will never be won by terrorizing others at the point of a gun. Technology's changed all things for once and for all. The earth has grown tiny, a planet so small that the death of a soldier in Kabul or Baghdad is like feeling the death of our own dear comrade. What happens in Afghanistan affects the folks in every land. Israel and Palestine, with their fears, wash the planet in painful tears. Repression in China sends out a wave that does a part of each enslave. Oil spilled on foreign shore sends the message home once more. Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, Jew, pagan, Mormon, or Hindu, we're all part of a greater whole. We are each part of the human soul. Technology is singing a sad requiem for those who still think there's an us and a them. The media have shrunk this planet so small that there's no room for misplaced emotions at all. The apparent distinction between us and them resides only in what we must condemn. We condemn what we fear, we turn it to hate, and in this ignorant act, we seal our own fate. But dams can't hold back the anger and fear. We must deal with our feelings, so let me be clear. We can each help right now in our own little way by making the right little choices today. As we eliminate wars amongst family and friend, peace will spread and conflicts will end. Global change takes place in the heart, with each of us playing our own little part. So at this precious time of year, let us not succumb to fear. Let us not feel terrified, insecure, or stuck inside. Let's make a commitment to make a new peace, and on this longest night, release our fears that were stirred for political cause. And on this longest night, take pause from neurotic wars of religious control as we reclaim the joy of body and soul. This time of year, these days of rest, when Persian magi journeyed west, we each share in love. We bask in love's glow. We have one another. That's all I know. And I know that this truth handed down from the past is most urgent now, and I hold to it fast. It's a truth handed down from days of old, a truth worth its very own weight in gold. Just look into your heart and to the stars above and remember the ancient truth we call love. And as another year slides into the past, remember that even these crazy times won't last. Now, lest you think I've given up, I'll ask you please to lift your cup. Filled with kindness, love, and the power of light, and truth that turns the darkness bright, on this shortest day, this deepest night, we toast to all who've done it right, who've stood their ground while facing fear, who've stood for truth and stood sincere. We look back through the lens of time. We tell our tales. I write my rhyme. We hold our candles to the dark. The light of love creates a spark that sets the atmosphere aflame with truth that puts the world to shame. So here's my toast. To lasting peace that starts inside, to every teacher who's been a good guide, to every child born in every nation, to every human congregation that aspires toward peace and love, to the glory of the stars above, to the lasting magic of this time of year, and to everyone, both far and near, and to the darkness that heralds the coming light. Soulful solstice to all, and to all a good night.
Oh. Wow.
That's what I do.
Wow. You write this every year on the solstice or right around this time of year?
Yeah, and this one is a compendium of several. This is what we astrologers would call a composite.
Wow, it is so amazing. Do we have your permission to post it somewhere?
We do, and I will send you the words.
Okay, thank you. And I want to read it to my daughters. I
Yeah.
mean, that is it, the
Well,
messaging in there.
again, this isn't a sales pitch because there aren't any left of these. But this was the book, The Gift of the Magi, and it was titled Christmas for a New Millennium, and it was filled with 8 of these poems with the story. And I printed, I think, 2,500 of them. They're all sold. This was like years ago. But every year I get emails from people saying, we've just opened up our Christmas box and your book is it. And every year we pick 1 or 2 of the poems and read them on Christmas Eve, and it's, so yeah, it's definitely, it's my version of A Night Before Christmas. And incidentally, one of my poems, I'm not going to read you another whole poem, but one of them started, this was written in the 90s. 'Twas the decade of change, and all over the earth a new human vision was ready for birth, and I in my own way had just settled down to write all about what I see around, and blah 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 blah. And it was basically it was The Night Before Christmas poem.
Love it. I'm wondering if there's any way I can convince you to potentially put those out again.
Probably not. Not
We'll
playing
see.
hard to get.
Rick, thank you so much. I feel like I can very confidently now speak about what's happening in the sky and how it relates to the Star of Bethlehem and the Christmas star. And it just feels very anchored in now. Thank you very
Cool.
much.
Yeah, this is it. Look, yeah, it's a magical time of year, whatever you want to call it. It doesn't matter. Even if you are in the Southern Hemisphere and you're in midsummer and it's the longest day, meaning the brightest, hottest day of the year, it doesn't matter where we are. Certainly in the north, and the further north we go, the more severe the darkness is and the more magical the potential of what might come of it, I think, is, metaphysically speaking. So, blessings to you, Amanda, to everyone at Astrology Hub, and to all of us on this planet right now. We need all the cosmic blessings that we can get. We all really need to do what we can to be open to the concept of spreading love, not hate.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Rick, for being here. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us. Thank you for sharing your passion, your enthusiasm. We love you so much.
Oh.
And thanks to all of you for tuning in, for being a part of our community. And thank you, as always, for making astrology a part of your life.